What if it never rained again? You might think that it can't possibly be a big deal. After all, we get by just fine without rain for months at a time. And sure enough, we could probably soldier on for years using our vast stores of underground water and our even vaster egos. But eventually we'd run out of water. The surface of the Earth contains around 71% water, but almost all of this is salt water in the oceans. Only a tiny percentage is fresh water, and of that small amount, roughly 2/3 is locked up in ice caps and glaciers, leaving us with less than 1% of all water on Earth to use as we please. And of that small amount, a large proportion is groundwater, which would still exist, though some of it might not be very drinkable. That means rainfall is by far our most important source of usable water. Without rain, we wouldn't have rivers or lakes or wetlands. We wouldn't have the water we need to grow crops or keep our cities from turning into dust bowls. In short, without rain, we're screwed, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we might be headed in that direction. While certain areas of the world have been experiencing record-breaking rainfall in recent years, resulting in catastrophic flooding, other regions are going through what can only be described as biblical droughts. But while some parts of the world are getting too much rain, others are getting too little. And it looks like these trends will only continue to get worse as the climate crisis continues to worsen. So let's imagine that one day the rains did stop and explore what would happen next. It goes without saying that we'd run into trouble pretty quickly. Within days, our reservoirs would start to dwindle. Within weeks, major cities would begin rationing water. And within months, conflict over water resources would likely boil over into open warfare. But those are all pretty short-term effects. What would happen further down the line? Well, first off, all plant life that isn't watered by humans would die. This includes about 3/4 of the world's farmland. Without rain, crops would fail globally, including the wheat fields of the American Midwest, the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, and the coffee plantations of South America. Even with irrigation, most farms couldn't survive more than a few months without rainfall to replenish underground water tables and top up reservoirs. The result would be a global food crisis, mass starvation, and famine. Some people might argue that we could get by on the 20% of farmland that is rain-fed, plus the fish we catch from the ocean. But that's not really an option. For starters, most of the land that isn't used for rain-fed farming is either desert or tundra, meaning that most of it isn't suitable for growing food. And even if we could somehow make deserts more hospitable to farming, we just don't have the technology to feed billions of people off of fish alone. But it's not just our plates that would be suffering. Forests and jungles would also wither and die, causing a cascade of negative effects throughout the rest of the ecosystem. As trees die, they'll release the carbon they've been storing for decades, centuries, or even millennia back into the atmosphere, accelerating the climate crisis that caused the drought in the first place. Wildlife would struggle to find food and water, leading to mass extinctions and collapsing ecosystems. Even if some species could adapt, they'd still have to contend with hordes of hungry predators whose populations were not kept under control by natural disasters. With no rain to speak of, the planet would become a far more hostile place. The fallout from all this would go beyond the natural world. Our cities would be in big trouble too. Even though most cities have systems in place to pipe water in from elsewhere, they still rely on rainfall to some extent. Rainwater fills rivers which feed into reservoirs that provide most of our drinking water. Without rainfall, these reservoirs would eventually dry up, cutting off the water supply to millions of people. On top of that, major cities are notorious heat traps. When the sun shines onto a built-up area, it's reflected back into the atmosphere by all of the buildings and infrastructure, creating an urban heat island effect. On a normal summer day, this effect can make city temperatures soar 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit above surrounding rural areas. But when there's no rain to speak of, things would be much, much worse. Major cities could become uninhabitable due to extreme heat, forcing residents to flee to cooler areas. This rapid urbanization would put huge strains on the infrastructure of whatever cities people were fleeing to, especially since refugees would likely be coming from areas that were hit hardest by the drought, meaning they'd need water and other resources desperately. But while urban areas would be hot, they would at least have some protection against the worst effects of the drought. After all, concrete jungles do tend to hold on to more water than grassy ones. Rural areas would fare much worse, especially those in hilly or mountainous terrain. There are lots of places around the world where rain is scarce and people have had to engineer their own solutions to make farming possible. But those engineering solutions often depend on a reliable amount of rainfall to work properly. For example, in the Middle East and North Africa, around 80% of the water used for farming comes from underground aquifers recharged by rainfall. Without rain, those aquifers would eventually run dry, killing off any crops they were irrigating. In fact, studies show that the region is already pumping water out of the ground faster than it can recharge, meaning that without a change in rainfall patterns, the entire region could become a desert within a matter of decades. Some places would fare better than others. For example, as long as its nuclear reactors were kept cool, Finland's capital, Helsinki, could probably carry on fairly normally, even if it never rained again. That's because unlike many other major cities, Helsinki gets most of its water from deep underground, protected aquifers that aren't affected by rainfall. In other words, Helsinki could become a kind of water-based Atlantis, surviving comfortably while the rest of the world turns into a desert wasteland. But for everyone else, life would become pretty difficult, which might end up being a good thing for the planet. Humans are famously adaptable, but widespread drought would force us to move around in unprecedented numbers. Some of us might choose to migrate to more hospitable areas, while others would be forced out of their homes by conflict over dwindling water resources. Areas that are currently too dry for large populations of humans would suddenly become prime real estate. Deserts would become bustling hubs of industry and agriculture, and the Arctic Circle would become the new Florida. Suddenly, no one would want to live in places like Death Valley, California, or the Sahara Desert in Africa. So while the end of rain would bring about a lot of bad things, it would also solve a lot of problems. Humanity's impact on the environment has caused some serious damage. A prolonged drought would force us to use resources more efficiently, reduce our consumption, and abandon environmentally damaging practices. Of course, this would cause a lot of pain and suffering in the short term, but eventually it might help pave the way for a more sustainable future. Now, this is all hypothetical, of course. There's no imminent danger of rain ending anytime soon, and even if there was, there's no way to actually stop the rain from happening anyway. But there is another possibility we haven't talked about yet, and that's climate engineering. It's a controversial idea, but some scientists have suggested that we could try to artificially trigger rain by injecting water vapor into the upper atmosphere. Other proposed solutions include building giant mirrors to reflect more sunlight away from the Earth, or placing sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere to block sunlight. But right now, none of these ideas are viable on a scale large enough to save us from a global drought, and there's no guarantee that they would even work. Stopping the rain altogether would be a disaster, but tinkering with the climate system carries its own risks. At the end of the day, it might just be easier to build an ark.